Welcome to another webinar in the series covering the VetCert standards. This session covers Unit 8 and Unit 9. Unit 8 is about legislation and Unit 9 is about risk. So Unit 8, legislation and official guidance in relation to veteran trees. You need to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the legislation affecting veteran tree management within the country of examination. You need to be able to detail that and how you would comply with it. So this is about applied knowledge and is in relation to all relevant fields of legislation that potentially have an impact on veteran tree management. Now, we don't expect the VetCert consultant to be a specialist in the field of legislation or literally be able to reproduce the paragraphs of laws and regulations, but we would expect the VetCert consultant to be familiar with all aspects of legislation which are relevant to veteran tree management and be able to comply with these during their work. So, for example, would be a tree that contains a protected species. Here, the consultant would be expected to know that this places restrictions on the work that can be done, for example, the time of year, but it would almost always require contact with the relevant authorities and potentially you need to bring in other expertise. And the types of legislation that we're talking about here that potentially are relevant or protected species I've mentioned, if biodiversity, other sorts of, in countries have different sorts of biodiversity legislation, including the Habitats Directive. Protected trees also vary from country to country, but they almost always require some sort of permit. There may be restrictions on felling. If it's a heritage tree, health and safety standards, national standards in relation to tree work, biosecurity, forestry legislation, historic and ancient monuments. So there's lots of different sorts of legislation which may have an impact on veteran tree management. And we would expect you to be able to have applied knowledge of that and to be comfortable in your understanding of the different sorts of legislation that are relevant and how you would comply with those. We would all expect you to demonstrate an awareness that if you do plan to work in another region or country, that the legislation may differ. It's obvious, perhaps, that different countries have different legislation, but if we take the UK, for example, the legislation may be different in Scotland from Wales and from England. So we expect you to be able to find out more before you undertake any work. For example, this photograph here is a tree in Germany, and this means that this tree has a natural monument status, which gives it legal protection and limits what can be done to it without permission. So just making yourself familiar with the local, regional, national legislation, which may vary, and that before you undertake any work, and if you do decide to go and work in a different country, you need to be able to get familiar with that knowledge or get help from someone who can help you become familiar. There is a fact sheet on legislation in different countries on the VetCert website too. So, Unit 9, Veteran Tree Risk Management. Now, most people who've worked with trees will have dealt with risk management, and this unit is intended to cover issues in relation to risk that may be particularly specific for veteran trees. So we would expect you to be able to undertake risk assessments according to the relevant guidance and take account of any special requirements for veteran trees. That's the kind of information that we're looking for you to be able to show as a VetCert specialist. But some basic things we would expect you to be able to do is identify the difference between the potential to cause harm, hazard, and the likelihood of a given severity of harm occurring, so the risk. So hazard versus risk, we would expect you to be able to understand and explain the difference. And that risk is a combination of factors, so likelihood of failure, likelihood of a target actually being there when it happens, and how severe any particular issue would be if that branch, for example, did fall. And being able to put that in some kind of context about mitigation in particular. So we're looking for a vet specialist to have a common sense approach to their risk management, and that moving the target should be the kind of first port of call when thinking about risk with regards to veteran trees, and that we would expect it always to include a kind of risk-benefit value analysis in relation to veteran tree management. So we would expect you to undertake a risk assessment of a veteran tree following a suitable methodology. So that's an area that we would test you on. Again, that's your applied knowledge, and that you must be able to undertake a risk assessment of a veteran tree. And there's all sorts of methods available, and they may be suitable. But it is quite often more challenging, I think, as we know, determining the likelihood of failure when working with veteran trees. That you should use the risk management guidance in your country and consider about the target, if it's possible to move the target, and that an appreciation that they are more complex than standard trees, which also means potentially the risk and likelihood of failure may be higher, but actually trying to identify whether that's going to happen or not may be actually more challenging than in standard arboriculture and, if you like, standard trees. A vet cert consultant would be expected to be able to undertake a risk-benefit analysis in order to inform veteran tree management. So evaluate the risk with the benefits as part of that process, that veteran trees often have a much higher value than that of young or mature trees. And that may well mean that it gives more reason, if you like, for accepting a greater level of risk, and that more efforts ought to be put towards moving the target, or specialist tree work rather than felling or hard reductions, and that this risk versus benefit and value analysis ought to feed into the decision-making process on how to intervene and manage the risk in relation to veteran trees. And also we would expect, I guess this is standard perhaps, that we would expect you to be able to demonstrate an appreciation that it's not possible to remove risk entirely. Risk needs to be managed to tolerable levels, and ALARP is one of the means by which that can be done, which is in this photograph about what's acceptable and what's tolerable and what's unacceptable. And in fact, in veteran tree management, zero risk is never the target. But it should be as low as reasonably practical, which is ALARP. And it cannot be based on perceived risk, but we would expect a vet cert specialist to have some method which is based on some kind of statistical approach, where possible, of the actual risk. And the approach to tree management and risk management needs to be set in a wider context as well. Clearly, we expect a vet cert specialist to be able to identify options other than felling or cutting or pruning the tree hard in order to manage risk. And we would expect not only you to be able to identify different options, but also to give a list of pros and cons for each option. So let's assume that you choose that actually we're going to do nothing, but we'll monitor the tree, or as that's one option. Another option is to undertake pruning. We would expect you to be able, what are the pros and cons of doing nothing compared with the pros and cons of actually undertaking some kind of pruning, and that target removal may be very positive. It's cheaper perhaps. The cons of that might be that you may damage the root system in the process if it's a bench or something that you need to dig up, or a road that you need to move. And that the interventions in the tree, even there, that you perhaps have several different options that may be available to you. So propping, cabling or bracing, pruning, and understanding again, what the pros and cons of those are. That we would expect you to be able to also, with the fact you may have several different options other than felling, and that each of those also have a kind of cost-benefit analysis. So when you think about your pros and cons, it may be that one thing is very costly or another is actually much cheaper. And of course, The VetCert consultant should strive to minimise the impact of risk management on the tree and its value wherever possible, just because these are such valuable features of our landscape. Resources that are available to you in relation to this unit. There is a book which is a few years old now, but Veteran Trees: A Guide to Risk and Responsibility, which is freely available to download. There's a video called Common Sense Risk Management of Veteran Trees, which is based on the National Tree Safety Guidance, and that's also available free of charge. Mention that the National Tree Safety Guidance is actually being undertaken and updated at the moment. So that's something that will be available, I'm sure, in the future. So next time, the units we'll cover are Unit 10, which is about planning, and Unit 11, which is personal skills. Unit 10 and Unit 12. Unit 11 will be a separate webinar because it's the largest of the units, so we'll do that all as one session, and these two will join together. So thank you, and see you next time.